Okay, I think let's give this a try, Lorraine.
Okay, I'm ready. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorraine, and I welcome you to the forum this morning. It's good to be together and share this time together, so I'm glad you're here. I did want to bring your attention to two things. Our speaker today is the Executive Director of organization Democracy Found. Next week on April 25th, we have a forum that's being presented by the Wisconsin Economic Development Agency. It's a way for me to remind you that the forums bring information to us about programming that is forming here at First Church. So it's a good way to learn how things are, what's happening here. We have a democracy group here, Defend Democracy, and that's a group of people interested in learning about that. And it's managed by Kathy Rivera. Also, the Wisconsin Economic Development Agency is here because there is a new partnership between First Church and social justice in helping areas of Milwaukee. So I just encourage you to know that that's an additional benefit of attending the forums. I'm going to read our disclaimer and then we'll slide right into Patricia Witt, who will introduce our speaker. Sunday forums have been part of Sunday morning for over 50 years at First Unitarian Society, Milwaukee. All scheduling and hosting is accomplished by volunteers. The forums support the First Church mission. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, inspire action. This lecture series showcases provocative and sometimes controversial speakers who review topical issues of the day. Forum topics are the responsibility of the presenters who share their point of view as formed through experience and knowledge. Every forum is not intended to express all sides of the topic nor all points of view. Presenters do not receive honoraria. Forums may not always align with the viewpoint of First Unitarian Society Milwaukee, but are meant to introduce thoughtful topics, which our members may pursue further on their own. Thank you, and I welcome Patricia Witt to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Lorraine. Well, I'm pleased to introduce Sarah Eskridge. She's the Executive Director of Democracy Found, a nonpartisan group working in Wisconsin toward revitalizing democracy. Sarah has a master's in public affairs and a master's in public health from UW-Madison. She has served on the Madison Common Council and several other Madison civic organizations. She's a member of First Unitarian Society of Madison. Sarah says her background in public health led her to look for root causes and systemic solutions to problems, where she became interested in Catherine Gale's work on politics industry theory. She's worked in this area for the past 3 years. She is going to explain the workings of Final Five voting and why this system benefits our democratic process. So thank you and welcome to Sarah.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you all so much for having me today. I usually start with a little intro on how I got engaged in this work, but Patricia summed it up very well, which is to say it really was the foundational work that Catherine Gale did to illustrate what's going wrong in our politics from this perspective of industry theory analysis, competition analysis. So it was really a light bulb moment for me because, as Patricia said, I have not worked as much in business, but in public health, we're always looking at what's going wrong from a systemic root cause perspective. So those are very analogous in how we got to both the problem diagnosis and, even more importantly, the solutions that we're working on at Democracy Found. So I'm just going to disclaimer to you all that I am not going to explain to you the entirety of politics industry theory in this brief forum. I highly recommend to you the book, The Politics Industry, if you are interested in learning more. And I'm really going to spend most of my time diving into the solution around Final Five voting, as Patricia mentioned, and what, I would say even more importantly, what we're doing to make that solution real here in Wisconsin at Democracy Found. So I hope that this first Venn diagram might strike a chord with you as it does with me perhaps not in the best of ways, which is to say, this really theory can be summed up with the fact that this should be a Venn diagram. These two circles around elected officials acting in the public interest should intersect with their likelihood of getting reelected. And yet, right now, if our elected representatives do their job the way we want them and need them to do their job, they're likely to lose their jobs. And that's the crazy design that we're going to talk about today and why we need to fix it to better serve our democracy. So, as I mentioned, the underlying theory lies in the fact that our system, the industry of politics itself, is not designed right now to serve the interests of the public. And that's because often we think about politics as some sacrosanct institution of government, but really politics isn't. Politics is an industry that has been optimized and fine-tuned over time by the players in the industry of politics. It's not the rules of governing that we're talking about. We're talking about this industry of all the money, all of the consultants, all the lobbyists that go into our politics industry today. And understanding the rules that were really created by the people in the industry, by those players, and how they've been optimized over time to serve their interests and not our interests as members of the public, is what can explain why we're not getting the results that we might want or deserve to get out of our public policy making process. So to put it differently, I can summarize at a really high level, which is to say, I think we all understand that in life, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played. And so the rules of the game in politics, in the politics industry, are also going to affect the way the game is played. And right now in politics, we have unhealthy competition, both unhealthy competition in elections and unhealthy competition in legislating. And the result of unhealthy competition in any industry is that customers are not well served. So even though the actors in the industry of politics are thriving these days, what we know is that the American public has never been more dissatisfied. We don't have to go into all those statistics today. I think it's suffice to say with you all that we know Congress's approval rating never seems to get above 20% these days. We're all quite dissatisfied with the performance of our elected officials in Washington, D.C. So why is this? And why is it that even when we send good people to Washington, D.C., elected officials who are there, who are trying to do their best, the rules of the game in politics still make even prisoners out of them? They feel like their only option is really lockstep allegiance to their side of the divide in our politics these days. So that's the situation. And really the question today is, what do we do about it? How do we change these rules to free up members of Congress and make competition in politics a win-win again? And that's focusing on the rules. So let's focus on the rules and let's think about the rules that are going to be most impactful to get to the result that we want to see, which I would summarize by saying we want results. We might not agree on particulars of policy or elected officials, but we can say we want politics that's able to solve our most complicated problems again. We want acting in the public interest to be able to happen again in Washington, D.C. So looking at the industry of politics through this competition lens, we identify two rules as the biggest obstacles and correspondingly our biggest opportunities that are really hidden in plain sight. We don't think about these very often, but they're incredibly powerful rules that explain why we're getting the results that we're getting. So those two structural problems are party primaries and plurality voting. Let me start with the first. So party primaries, most of us, when we pause to think about it, we understand that most elections are actually decided in the primary these days. So candidates are pulled further to the right and further to the left than most of us as voters really want. And in over 80% of our races for Congress, the winner is decided in the primary because there's no real competition in the general election. Whoever makes it through, that's the person who's going to get elected. So that's a problem in and of itself. But the real problem that explains the dysfunction that we are talking about today is that influence of party primaries, that system of pulling people apart further to the right and further to the left, extends not just to campaigning, but it extends to governing. So party primaries are one of the greatest structural contributors to the fact that we have gridlock and really partisan stagnation in Washington, D.C. these days. So let's illustrate that with an example. Pretend for a moment with me that you are a member of Congress, you're serving in Washington, D.C., and you're looking at some opportunity to pass a bill that's going to address one of our nation's biggest problems. Take any issue you care about: healthcare, immigration, our economy, education, any issue, and think about some sort of pragmatic, common sense solution to fixing that problem. If you're looking at a bill, likely a bipartisan bill that would do that, fix that problem, or at least advance it, you might think that as an elected official, you need to ask yourself a handful of questions. You would maybe ask yourself, is this good policy? Is this even the right policy for the country as a whole? Is this policy going to solve the problems that it purports to solve? Or even, is this policy something that the majority of my constituents would want me to vote for? But the problem in politics right now is that none of those questions really matter at all. The question that matters more than any of those super important questions when you're a legislator in Washington, D.C., is, will I make it back through my party primary if I vote for this? Because if the answer to that question is no, which it virtually always is going to be on some sort of common sense piece of problem-solving legislation, the rational incentive for you as an elected official is to vote no on that bill. Because if you vote yes, you're likely to have a party primary challenger, either on your right or on your left, because that piece of legislation isn't perfect enough for either side, right? It's not ideologically pure enough for either side. So party primaries make it so that there's this bizarre eye of the needle problem where no problem-solving politician can basically pass through. So that's one of the biggest reasons that we don't see progress on some of our biggest issues facing our country, because there's no incentive to do that complicated work, because it's not going to appease your side fully. The other reason that we don't get results in governing is because there's no accountability for not getting results. And there's no accountability because in this industry of politics, we only have two choices as the customer. So in any other, if you step back, think about it, in any other industry where customers, us the voters, are as dissatisfied as we are with politics, there would be some new competitor to the market who would come in and try to serve our dissatisfied needs, to satisfy those needs and give us what we want. Because basically any other entrepreneur would see this business opportunity and know that there's demand there, right? Because there's only two players. But that doesn't happen in politics because there are these huge barriers to entry in the industry of politics. And the single greatest structural barrier to entry is how we vote. Specifically, problem number 2, plurality voting. So we don't think about this very often because when our country was young, there weren't really any examples of democracy. We were pretty early in creating democracy. And so our leaders copied the electoral system that was used in British countryside elections at the time. That election system being first past the post, or plurality voting, it's sometimes described as, which is to say you win by getting the most votes, but not necessarily a majority of votes. You only have to win with a plurality, not a majority. So plurality voting inherently means that in any race, if there are more than 2 candidates, the winner could have far less than a majority of support. So imagine even just a 3-way race that's competitive, where if someone could win with 34% of the vote in a 3-way race right now. Meaning, if you step back, that 66% of the electorate preferred someone other than the winner. And that's a little crazy when we pause to think about it in and of itself. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem representative. But even more importantly, we argue in our work is that that design choice makes it so that any new substantive threat of competition in our industry of politics is basically not going to happen, because any new competition is going to be either a spoiler or a wasted vote. And so you've probably all thought about this before, even if you haven't thought about it in these terms, which is to say, if you're going in and voting, you may have liked a different candidate, an independent or a third party candidate, or a candidate who might not even decide to put their name on the ballot if they're not a major party candidate. Because if you vote for that candidate, you know that they're very unlikely to win. So if you vote for them, you're basically throwing your vote away. You're wasting your vote. Or even worse than wasting your vote, you might be inadvertently helping the person you like the least to get elected. So let's go back a couple cycles so that we don't have to get too partisan here. But let's think about the 2016 election, where if perhaps you didn't want to vote for, perhaps you were a Jill Stein fan, you wanted to vote for Jill Stein in that election, you might not do that because you're going to inadvertently take votes away from Hillary Clinton and elect Donald Trump. And if you're on the right, you wouldn't have wanted to vote for the Libertarian candidate in that race, who was Gary Johnson at the time, because you would inadvertently take votes away from Donald Trump and perhaps elect Hillary Clinton, who you'd like least or less. So that problem of spoiling is the reason that in this industry of politics, it's an industry where we're regularly told that less competition is better for us, that other people should just stay out of the race. Don't put your name in because you'll be a spoiler or you'll be a wasted vote. And that shouldn't be the case. It doesn't have to be that case, because ultimately accountability comes from having some sort of check, some sort of new choices for us all to make, some sort of healthy competition of new candidates to pick. So that gets us to the solution, which is to address both of these structural design problems. So first, let's just get rid of party primaries. Final five voting is a two-step way of voting, which first gets rid of party primaries and says, instead of having to go in and choose whether you're going to vote on the Democratic primary ballot or the Republican primary ballot, let's just put all the candidates on one ballot and vote for our favorite candidate, regardless of their party affiliation. So I'll just vote for the Green Bay Packers because they are my favorite. And out of that primary, the top 5 vote getters advance to the general election. So in the general election, you have this choice of 5 different candidates, and you basically go through and do what we all do in life all the time, which is rank the choices to say, oh, I definitely know who my favorite is. I know who I guess I would vote for if I have to. That's, 2 and 3. And then I don't know who this person is. And then you definitely know who you don't want to win, right? Over your dead body, do you want your 5th choice to win? So you use this tool called ranked choice voting, a ranked choice voting ballot in the general election, to do that ranking. To, if you want to, just vote for the Packers. I can stop there and my vote will count just like it does today. I voted for the Packers in the primary, I'll vote for them in the general election and consider it done. But I can also tell you that if I can't have the Packers, who I would also prefer. So I can fill out the rest of that ballot and not waste my vote if in fact the Packers were not likely to win. That allows us to have an election where someone wins with a true majority, because in a ranked choice voting race in this general election, what you do is you count all the first place votes first. And if someone wins with first place votes, with over 50% of first place votes, the election's over and they win, right? Because they have over 50%, they have majority support. But if no one wins in that first round of counting, basically technology just enables a series of runoff elections, but you've already cast all of your votes. So you don't have to go back for that runoff and recast your vote because you indicated your preferences on your ballot. So you drop the lowest place candidate. If you voted for that person, you have your second choice counted, and it continues in rounds like that until one candidate goes over that threshold of 50%. So we call it instant runoff voting, because it is essentially that. It's just a series of runoffs that happens instantaneously because of that tool of a ranked choice voting ballot. And that system of opening up the party primary to having those top 5 candidates compete in the general election and then using instant runoff in the general election makes sure that ultimately the candidate who wins has the broadest support amongst all the voters in their district. And even more importantly, in some ways, it allows for competition to create accountability in the system, because you have the opportunity for new competitors to really make a difference under the system of Final 5 voting. So if we think back to our original example of us being elected officials in Washington, D.C., in that original Venn diagram where there was no intersection between the doing your job and the likelihood of getting reelected in your job, we solve that problem with Final 5 voting, because you can now look at that bipartisan piece of legislation that's a nuanced compromise to some complex problem, frankly, that's going to be some sort of nuanced compromise. And you can vote yes for that now, because as an elected official, you no longer have the threat of a party primary to take you out from your right or left flank. You will, in a top 5 primary, if you're an incumbent and you're doing your job well generally, you can imagine you'll make it through a top 5 primary. You have all this name recognition, you're doing your job well, all those reasons. And then in the general election, because of the ability to rank, you can win with a coalition of support. You can get first place, second place, maybe even third place votes from enough people to craft a true majority of support from your district. So that this new system really realigns incentives for elected officials in Washington, D.C. when they're governing. And one of the exciting things about this combination of a top 5 primary and ranked choice voting and what we call Final 5 voting is that, as we all now know, probably more than maybe we'd like after the 2020 election, we all know that election administration happens at the local level and states determine election rules. So every state, Article 1 of the US Constitution tells states that we have the power to decide how we want to elect our federal representatives to Washington, D.C. It doesn't take a constitutional amendment to change the way we vote. It takes state legislation. So that means we have the opportunity to really enact this change, to make this change happen. And we don't even need all 50 states to make this change in electoral incentives to start making a difference in how governing happens in Washington, D.C. Because you can imagine that if maybe even only 5 states changed how they sent their delegations to Washington, D.C., we would have 10 US senators who would be elected under this different system of incentives and allow them the flexibility to do problem solving, to operate in the nuanced solutions to our nation's biggest challenges, and provide that fulcrum of support in the US Senate to get things done. That's incredibly powerful and a really impressive way to, frankly, buck the partisan stranglehold that we have on governing right now in Washington, D.C. So excitingly, it's already starting to happen. Alaska passed a ballot initiative in 2020 to change their election rules to this system of an open primary and an instant runoff general election. And it will be in place in Alaska in 2022. And here in Wisconsin, we've built support at Democracy Found with a fabulous group of co-sponsors in our state Senate and in our state assembly to do this, to change our election rules for federal elections to Final 5 voting. And it's getting support. It's gotten support from the editorial board in the Wisconsin State Journal. The La Crosse Tribune have both editorialized to say, yes, let's do this. We need to get it done in Washington, D.C. And we need to get it done in Wisconsin, pragmatically, in a bipartisan way. So we have over 20 co-sponsors for our legislation right now, includes Republicans and Democrats, a really strong coalition of people. We also have the support from one of our members of the delegation, U.S. Representative Mike Gallagher from the Green Bay area is a supporter of this. So the momentum is building in Wisconsin because people know that I think we all know that incentives drive results. And so when you pause to think about it, you understand that, of course, if the incentives are not aligned correctly for our federal representatives, we're not going to get results out of Washington, D.C. either. And that's something that can pragmatically change in a way that's not partisan, because it's not intended to change even necessarily who gets elected. It's intended to change those incentives for what our elected officials are doing when they're governing. So you can have a frank political conversation with someone and say, look, this is not going to change a blue district red or a red district blue, but it's going to make sure that whoever gets elected in that district represents the true majority of their constituents, not the less than 20% of people who turn out for party primaries. And that's really causing us some serious problems in our democracy right now. So I'm not going to say a lot more today because I think it's going to be way more interesting to have a conversation. I will just say, this was already mentioned, that our website is democracyfound.org. We've got a huge and growing list of supporters. That's a handful of pictures thrown up here of members of our leadership and supporter list, including people who are on the call today. I see Russ is here. He's been a fabulous supporter of ours. So we're growing the momentum. And what it takes right now is getting the word out. So I'm really happy to be with you all today because Final Five voting is new. When I gave this presentation to Patricia, I don't know, a few months ago, maybe, the ask was, think about opportunities where we can share this, because people have never heard of Final Five voting before. And once you hear about it, once you know that it's a solution that's out there, it's really empowering to be able to talk about something that is nonpartisan, that's supported in a bipartisan way in our state legislature, and could really get at some of the root cause problems that we have in governing right now. So please go to our website, join us if you're interested in learning more. And I will, I think, just pause there. I can stop sharing my screen and we can dive into questions.
Well, I can just get us started. This is Lorraine.
Great.
We do have some questions in the chat and we could start there. The first one asks, which countries already use ranked choice voting? But there's also a question about other places in the US that are using this now. So kind of get a sense of how it's being used in other places.
Sure, great set of questions. So what I will say is that we are very intentional about talking about Final Five voting and the fact that it is the combination of a change to the primary and that method of ranked choice voting in the general election. And the reason is, if you don't interrupt the party stranglehold on the primary process, you're not going to change the incentives in governing. So I'll give you the answer to the question, which is to say that ranked choice voting has been used various places all across the country and in other countries, but the systems are slightly different. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So in over 10 states across the US, municipalities have implemented ranked choice voting. So even our neighbors in Minneapolis and St. Paul, they've had ranked choice voting for their municipal elections for, I think, over a decade, for a long time. Cambridge, Massachusetts, San Francisco, a handful of cities in Utah, some cities in New Mexico, just recently a city in Michigan, East Point, Michigan. So a lot of cities have implemented ranked choice voting because municipal elections are already nonpartisan. So in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, municipal elections are nonpartisan. So you can implement ranked choice voting and frankly, even just get rid of the primary, just use ranked choice voting to get to a candidate that has majority support. So similarly, in places like Australia, they've used ranked choice voting for a very, very long time, I think almost a century in Australia. But I caveat that to say, and in Ireland as well, and in other countries, they have different electoral systems in general. They have often a kind of a party-based system, some sort of proportional representation-based system. So it's, again, not exactly analogous, but it is to say we've reached a point where we can do this. We know we can do it technologically. We've implemented it in various ways. And even from these experiments, which include now the use of ranked choice voting for state and federal elections in the state of Maine, Maine has been using ranked choice voting since the 2018 election very successfully. So we know from the evidence that one of the biggest pieces of pushback we get to this is, oh my gosh, it's probably going to be too complicated for voters to rank their choices, right? People underestimate that voter. I editorialize, people underestimate voters. But we found that voters love the system. When asked in exit polling whether or not they want to keep ranked choice voting in Maine, they absolutely want to keep it. They say it was fairly easy to use. It was easy to use. And and error rates are not any higher than during a current, an election under our current system. So that was a very long answer to a couple questions about where it's used, but a little bit more context for you all on ranked choice voting and its interaction with Final Five voting.
Thank you. There is one other question that's kind of a logistical one as well. And then there are some pretty longer and philosophical ones, which you may want to read first. But the question that is more logistical is the question about recounts and audits. We've had that issue come up recently, and it was important to have paper ballots. We aren't really trusting of the computer, just let the computer tell us. So how does ranked choice voting work in terms of recounts and audits that we feel comfortable with?
Sure, it's a great question. And one of the things that we're doing at Democracy Found, the organization that I run, is putting together an engagement effort with our county and our municipal clerks to figure out exactly, as we're advocating for this piece of legislation in our state legislature, how we will implement it together. But I can say that you still vote on a paper ballot. So you still have a paper ballot with ranked choice voting. You don't do it directly into the computer, because we know the gold standard is to put things on paper ballots and then tabulate it through the machine so that you have that ability to go back and manually recount the paper ballots if you need to. So that piece of election integrity doesn't change whether or not it's a ranked choice election or an election using our current system. So I'll just add to this question, which is we often get asked, especially right now, about, there's all these conversations about election audits and fraud or whatever in the 2020 election. So people are asking about that, how do we make sure that this is a system that people trust? And all to say, you can administer a ranked choice voting election in exactly the same way that you would any other election, because right now, well, one, you use a paper ballot, and two, we use election tabulators. If any of you have worked the polls on election day, you know that, or even just voted, you feed your ballot into a machine often. Well, those machines, if they're fairly new or recently updated, they have the ability to process a ranked choice ballot. So they just tabulate it differently. And if you want to go, there are some places in Wisconsin that still hand count their ballots, if you can believe it. You can hand count a ranked choice ballot. It takes longer, but when Minneapolis implemented ranked choice voting originally, the machines didn't tabulate yet. So they had to count manually, and they set up processes to do that. So again, long answer to say, you implement an election just like you'd implement any election. The ballot just looks different, and voters have that ability to show their true full preference for candidates on the ballot.
Thank you. Good. There is a statement and a question from Ann Batista that you might want to take a look at, Sarah. It has to do with a fraud lawsuit through the Democratic Party.
Oh, okay. I think the crux of this question, and Anne, jump in if I'm not addressing it fully, but there is this question of how, what is the role of primaries in determining candidates? And so if you go back, and party identification of candidates, if you go back, we often like to talk about this in Wisconsin when we're doing our advocacy work, which is to say, Wisconsin was one of the pioneers when it came to the last round of political reform and innovation that we had during the progressive era in the early 1900s. So Bob La Follette, if you all remember fighting Bob La Follette. And at that time, we made this change to primaries, which was to say, previously, parties had just chosen their candidate. There was no kind of public engagement in the choice of a primary candidate. They were definitely done in those smoke-filled rooms, and whoever, I think there's some famous quote about whoever does the nominating does the winning, or something. I'm terrible about remembering quotes, something like that. There's a lot of power in that, right? In who gets the nomination. And so it was seen as this progressive era reform. It was a progressive era reform to take that out of back rooms and put it to the people on a ballot, and put primary elections on a ballot, to give people that choice over who the party candidate should be, to make that nominating something that the people would do. So that was very, I would say, successful for a long period of time, where voters got to choose in the primary. But what we've seen more recently is that primaries, especially because they are such low turnout elections, where only 20% of voters generally vote, and that's frankly good. That's a good rate, unfortunately, for a primary election turnout. You end up with a very small segment of the electorate choosing. And it makes it very easy for special interests and for parties to continue to control that process, whether it's clear or a little bit covert. There's a lot of power in playing in party primaries right now. And so the discussion legally around this, there's a bit, I'm not an attorney, so I won't get into too much of the legalese here, and we've done a lot of research with attorneys to make sure that there's nothing unconstitutional about the idea of opening up primaries. There, sometimes in states like Washington that have moved to a top two system, there's just a disclaimer on the ballot that says something like this affiliation after someone's name does not mean the party has endorsed this candidate. So it kind of solves for that problem to say there might be, in a final five election in a Republican district, there might be 2 or 3 Republican candidates on your general election ballot. And the party could then go ahead and endorse 1, 2, maybe all 3 of those candidates. But it takes the party endorsement process kind of back to the private organizational process that I would argue it should be, not a taxpayer-funded election that prohibits them from participating. So did I kind of hit at your question, Ann, or was there more that I jump in if there's more?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear what you were saying at the end. To me, this seems to really subvert the will of the people when it comes, because primaries play such an important role in determining the eventual outcome of elections, and also limiting our choices, that this is really a critical issue. Also, I think it's worse than shenanigans. The illegalities that go on during primary elections to ensure that whatever the chosen candidate is gets elected. I think you're right to focus on primary elections as the key aspect of this whole process.
Yeah, thank you. You're exactly right. I mean, the focus on primaries is very intentional, and because it needs to be. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I'm jumping in with another comment. Russ has some familiarity with what happened in Florida, and both parties totally found this to be threatening. And they spent all kinds of money and fought it, and they were successful in not having it start. How do you respond to that? But also, how do you support and back the process among people in a local area in making a more favorable presentation about the voting?
Yeah, about final five voting.
Yeah, final five.
Yeah. It's a great question, and Russ is more familiar with this than most. I know he's following it closely. So I'll explain Florida's a really interesting example. They had on their ballot a top 2 primary system. So it's not exactly the same as final 5, but it is the same idea of opening up a party primary to letting whoever the top 2 candidates, in the case of the Florida example, advance to the general election. So California has moved to top 2, Oregon has moved to top 2, and Nebraska has top 2 essentially for their state races because they have a nonpartisan legislature. So it was on the ballot in 2020 for Florida voters to vote for this. And I think it was something like 56% of voters voted to open up to a top 2 primary system. But in Florida, the threshold for ballot initiatives is 60%. So you don't just have to get a majority, you have to get 60% support to pass a ballot initiative in Florida. And as many of you might know, ballot initiatives, only about half of the states even have ballot initiatives as a tool. Ballot initiatives can be very difficult to win because they, in some ways, they're inherently more political because they're happening during an election. There's a vote on it. There's something about having a deadline where you're voting yes or no or on something that I would argue makes it, it plays into the political process in the typical way a little bit more. But I'd say even more importantly than that, one of the reasons that they saw bipartisan party opposition to this in Florida, as Russ points out, is that there is something inherently challenging to the party system, or at least interrupting of the way they currently do business amongst the parties when you take the power away from just the 2 parties and open it up for more potential competition. So when we're talking about this with people who are very involved in parties or party leaders, I always try to point out that there's nothing inherently beneficial or harmful to parties about Final Five voting. It's just different. So it's a different system, which any change in any industry, in any area of our life, there's often resistance to change. I think we can all appreciate and acknowledge that because the parties know how to operate in our current electoral system. They've been doing it for many, many, many years. So if you know what you're doing in a current electoral system, the idea of changing it can be seen as inherently threatening, even if it may not end up being threatening to either party. They may maintain their stature. That change is something that draws resistance, especially from those who are in leadership. So what we found in Florida was that there were interesting examples where party leadership would be very opposed, but you ask a general person who's affiliated with a party, and clearly 56% of them thought it was a good idea in Florida. So it's often the resistance that we get to this, even on Final Five voting, when talking about it in Wisconsin, comes more from those who are in party leadership or those who have been involved in the political workings of politics for a very long time, working elections, because they need to learn how to do things differently. So one of the things that, again, we point out is that it's not intended to change who gets elected. You're still going to have a Democrat win in a Democratic district. You're still going to have a Republican win in a Republican district. You're just making sure that that person is more accountable to their general electorate and frankly, more representative of their general electorate, and allows then, again, I try to take the logic one step further, and this is theoretical, so it's often a little bit more challenging when you're talking about it. But if you want to take it one step further, you can imagine that as a party leader right now, if you actually want to solve problems, it's very difficult because often there are people in your own caucus who are, I'll just say bluntly, obstinate, right? They're not going to do anything that's compromise oriented or going to solve a problem because it is likely not ideologically perfect enough. I said this earlier, to help them survive in their district that's perhaps not competitive from a red or a blue perspective. The only threat that they have right now is from their ideological extreme through a primary. So they have no incentive to get creative and come together in give governing because the act of compromising in and of itself is going to give them an electoral threat. So if you play that out in your leadership and you're trying to get things done, getting a coalition of votes to move things can be really challenging. So again, this is a little bit of the insider baseball, but some of those political calculuses, I think, are going to start weighing on people on both sides of the aisle. additionally, a political calculus that I think it works in our favor as we advocate for Final Five voting moving forward is the fact that more and more people are not identifying with one party or another. They're identifying as independents, they're identifying as outside of the two-party system, and they're getting more and more willing to throw their votes away on candidates who are not those major party candidates. And as you have elections where, especially in more competitive districts, 3 or 4% of the vote could swing an election one way or another, you end up maybe wanting those second place votes to count so that that third party or independent candidate doesn't end up spoiling that election. So again, I'm going a little into the weeds, but I hope that's some helpful context on the political calculus for this sort of work.
Very good, thank you. There is another question from someone who went to your website, made a quick review of the folks listed there for supporting, and found that what she could see, they looked mostly to the right of opinions. Do you have a sense of the distribution of your support people?
Yeah, let me tell you a story. So we sometimes, I'll talk about, it's church, we can talk about religion, right? We used to joke that this is like the Noah's Ark approach. We had to, for one Democrat, we had to take one Republican. For one Republican, we had to take one Democrat when building our leadership, because it's so important, both in reality and in appearances, that the work be bipartisan. And when we added our legislative co-sponsors and we worked on getting co-authors for our bill, we weren't going to introduce our bill until we were sure that we had a Democrat and a Republican in each chamber to introduce that legislation, because having the bill be bipartisan is the only way we're going to have a chance to getting it passed. So we are super focused on that bipartisanship. So if you look at our website, they are actually across the entire political spectrum, people who are supporting our work, and generally pretty balanced in that. When it gets to supporters, I let everyone sign on as a supporter, so I don't have any, I can't tell you if there's a partisan lean there, but in terms of our leadership, we have been very diligent to make sure that when we add on one side, we add on the other side. And again, the story here is that when we started this work, it was actually prior to when I came on as executive director, our co-chairs, Catherine Gale and Austin Ramirez, who also both kind of represent one side and the other themselves, brought together this big gathering at the Pfister of maybe 400 people in the room together. And on stage at that event, you had Line D-Line, who, if any of you know Line, she's one of the biggest funders of progressive causes in the state of Wisconsin. She's funded Democrats for years and years and years. And Andy Nunemaker, who's this young business guy who I think he was the only person who had a fundraiser for then candidate Donald Trump in his home in 2016. So these two do not agree on any candidates or generally any policy positions, but they stood on stage together and they said that even though they disagreed on candidates and policy solutions, they could agree that our system needed to work. Our system of government needed to work. And so they were going to work together on Final Five voting in Wisconsin until they got it done. Even if they were continuing to support different candidates and different policy solutions, they would stay together on this because it was so important to the health and future of our democracy that we are able to get this done. So it's that level of commitment from people on both sides of the aisle that is so important to our organization being potentially successful in Wisconsin.
3 questions I'll try to put together a bit. Okay. So wondered about your organization, Democracy Found. Is it in every state? Is it a grassroots kind of thing? Do you get groups going? Is there some estimate of when we might see a bill in Madison for this? Do states become members or individuals become members? All those little logistical things.
Absolutely. I appreciate those questions. So our organization, Democracy Found, is Wisconsin specific. We are focused only on work in Wisconsin.
Oh.
We're focused on the bill that's been introduced in the state legislature. So there is a bill on both the Senate and in the Assembly. I think it's SB 250 and AB 244. It's been introduced. And we're really intentional about doing this work in Wisconsin and in a Wisconsin way. So there are other states that are moving similar efforts forward for nonpartisan political innovation. Like I said, Alaska already passed a version of Final Five. They did Final Four voting in Alaska. But every state is going to look slightly different because of the political realities and contexts in their state. So their campaign is potentially going to be a ballot initiative campaign if it's a ballot initiative state. It's potentially going to be legislative like it is here, where we don't have ballot initiatives, so we have to do it through state legislation. So that degree of flexibility and making sure that states have the ability to build their own campaigns from their own state leaders, both grass tops, grass middles, grassroots, all through the leadership, we believe in order for these sorts of efforts to be successful, they need to be state specific and state operated. Now, that said, Catherine Gale, who wrote The Politics Industry and who co-founded Democracy Found in Wisconsin, does promote this work nationally, because we've hardly reached the tipping point on people knowing what Final Five voting is. So there is an organization that she has created called the Institute for Political Innovation that's all about making sure that the theory and scholarship that she's created gets out there and is something that state leaders will then see and then go and create their own version of Democracy Found in their state. And there's some ability to help with that. So, if you're interested or of people who might be interested in other states, feel free to send them to the Institute for Political Innovation's website. And I can drop some websites in the chat here, but feel free to direct them there to see if there's an effort happening in their state that they could get involved with. And if you're in Wisconsin, please go to our website and sign up. There's a form at the bottom of the webpage where you just enter your name and your email address, and I will make sure you're on our list, and you can be noted as a public supporter if you're interested in being a supporter. And I'll keep you updated on ways that you can get engaged in our effort here in Wisconsin.
Okay, great. We have one comment from Anne, and I think we'll call this the last one. And then if you want to give some closing remarks and things, right, Sarah, that would be great. It seems to me this is, and maybe you can read it too, but it seems a bit of an opinion piece about why people are voting independent. They feel disenfranchised and not very strong. But she's wondering about how do we overcome this overpowering sense of it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of the challenge in front of us, which is to say people, I think, in some ways have very rationally disconnected from politics and decided to just throw their hands in the air and say, I'm not even going there anymore, because anything that I do, it doesn't seem to be making a difference. It doesn't seem to be changing. All of these examples that you threw in the chat, and that we know people support them and yet nothing happens on them. And so that's why I'll speak for myself. That's why I feel so strongly about working on Final Five voting, because those electoral incentives are really root causes. When you want to get rid of all the stuff on top and get to what is wrong with our system, elections are supposed to be the accountability mechanism in representative democracy, in our form of government, in a republic like we live in. And so when elections aren't functioning in that way of holding elected officials accountable for doing their job, something is very wrong. Something is misaligned. Something is not working correctly. And so if we don't then respond in a similarly systemic way to figuring out where those misalignments are, we're likely not going to fix the problem. So again, I can care about so many different issues, and and want to see different results in different areas, and recognize as well that really none of that matters until we fix this electoral accountability problem and the system of democracy and representative government itself, because that's so foundational. So that's why getting over this information hurdle of helping people to see this as a solution that's available to us at a state by state level is so empowering. And you can tell I'm clearly excited about it and clearly enthusiastic about the progress that we're making so far in Wisconsin, and the fact that we can make progress like this in other states and already start to make that difference on results that we see out of Washington, D.C., because people are going to need to start seeing those results so that they plug back in and start to care again and start to engage again in the things that will really make a difference, because people are rational and they're prioritizing their time on things that matter. And I can appreciate that it might feel right now like our democracy, like politics, is not something that's a place to prioritize and put your time and effort in. And I think that's why it's so important for people to see opportunities like Final Five voting that are being done in a bipartisan way and focus on these systemic changes as a way that you can plug in very powerfully and make a big difference.
Lorraine,
Yes.
I have a question, Sarah. Nobody has talked about money. And do you see this reducing the amount of money in politics, or what's going to happen with money?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. And I'm also surprised that no one said money yet, because it always comes up as a question or concern. So really, this change is not likely. We don't know yet, right? Because we haven't actually implemented Final Five voting anywhere and looked at the results. So let me start with that. But from a theoretical perspective, theoretically, this isn't going to have a huge impact one way or another about money in politics, except that right now, money is a fairly predictable return on investment in politics. That's because our elections are so predictable in many ways. We know who's going to win in so many of our districts. I think it's 86% of our congressional districts are ranked uncompetitive. So if you're an investor and you're trying to put money in somewhere and you know 86% chance who's going to win, that's a very predictable return on that investment. So inherently, competition and accountability and less predictable results in elections could have the impact of making money less valuable because it will be less predictable. Now, I don't pretend that Final Five voting is going to give us the solution that a constitutional amendment would give us when it comes to money in politics. That's a different thing, right? That's a different fight. That's a different challenge that faces our country. But I do think that theoretically, understanding that competition might have indirect impacts on the power of money is very motivating to thinking this will make at least some sort of a difference in the right direction, and in my opinion, the right direction.
I just have one thing occurred to me as well. So sorry, I keep asking questions. In addition to money, I wonder too, what comes first? Do we work on ending gerrymandering, or do we work on ranked choice voting, and how they all affect each other? Because it seems like a pretty big project.
Yeah, Lorraine, thanks for that question as well, because that's also one that often comes up, which is the interaction between how districts are drawn and Final Five voting. So what I will say is one of the benefits of Final Five voting is that it makes the elected official representative of their district, of their entire district, however that district is created. So even in a system where you still have, very partisan districts, either because they've been drawn that way through gerrymandering or because people tend to geographically live by people who they agree with, right? Whatever you wanted, because people feel differently about gerrymandering, right? Some people think it's a political thing. Some people think it's not. It's just people living by people who agree with them. So no matter how you feel about that, you can appreciate that when you are living around people who agree with you, and you have a system where the primary election is the only election that matters, you're limiting competition. So it's what Anne was saying earlier about, that's why you have to focus on the primary, because that lack of competition out of the primary, and that, especially if you have a gerrymandered district, means that there's no chance of anyone else's voices mattering. So if you're not a member of that party that is likely to win in that district, your vote really doesn't matter. And it pains me to say that, but it's true. So at least in a Final Five system, your vote matters. In a general election, your vote matters no matter what party you're aligned with, and no matter how partisan your district is. And that's really empowering, I believe, for voters. And that's why I prioritize working on Final Five voting above and beyond any other electoral or democracy related challenge, because I think it's achievable. And I think it really does address the root causes of what's causing us the most problems in our democracy. And it's achievable in part because we've built a coalition of bipartisan support for it. It has not been captured by one side of the aisle or the other in terms of messaging and support, which we have to keep steadfastly working to make sure that it continues to stay that way. So we do our best at Democracy Found to make sure that we are doing that, and making sure that we have the political support ultimately to get this across the finish line, because we're results oriented, we're pragmatic. We want to make sure that this gets done.
Okay, there's a couple questions about how do we learn more, and how can I really understand how this works? Your website, or do you have other suggestions?
Yes, please go to the website, and there's a 2-minute and 30-second long video that probably does a better job than my hour-long presentation to you all at animating how the system itself works. So I recommend that to you all. And if you're interested in more and kind of pieces of this presentation again, because I think the other thing is just hearing it multiple times, there's a 17-minute TED Talk that I recommend to you all, and I'll throw that in the chat as well. Okay. But Catherine Gale has a TED Talk that was recently put on TED.com, which is very exciting, that does a fabulous job of outlining Final Five voting and the case for it. So I just threw it in the chat. Please check that out, and please share that, because it's a really easy way to tell your friends, family, neighbors, watch this. It's 17 minutes, and you'll get the crux of this, and then we can talk about something, even if maybe it's someone that you don't usually feel comfortable talking about politics with, because maybe they're on the other side of the aisle. I recommend to you all sharing it with your person that you don't usually talk about politics with. And I hope you will see the similar results that I do, which is that this gives you something you can agree on together.
I'm lost. I got out of Zoom.
Oh, we still hear you, Lorraine.
Oh, okay, good. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
we see you.
I can't see you, so I don't know. I don't know if there's any other questions, but is it time to close? I'm thinking it might be.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any
okay.
other hands or anything.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. Is there just something you'd like to just say to close, or Mark will let us know when he's closing down the Zoom?
Well, I'm just throwing my email into the chat as well. Please reach out if you're interested in getting involved and learning more, or if you have any specific questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking in the large group today. I'm always available and would look forward to further conversations with any of you. On a personal note, it's really fun to talk to another group of Unitarians. So as a member of my whole life at FUS in Madison, it's fun to talk to you all about this exciting change that could really improve our politics and help us live out the ideals. You know, I think about social justice missions that we're all, I think, kind of jointly agree on as being important, and respecting differences of opinions, and And this is a way that we could systemically really make that change more possible in our representative democracy and help make sure that it is accountable and representative again. So I hope you leave this feeling a bit empowered and excited and ready to share the message with your networks and friends and family and get involved.
Thank you.
Great.
Yes,
Thanks so much, Sarah, for coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to stop the live stream and also end the meeting. So